My name is Fletcher Oakes. I am 67 years old, and for the last 2 of those years I have been the sole guardian of a promise I made to my wife Connie the week before she died. She squeezed my hand and said, "Don't let anyone turn it into parking lots, Fletch." I promised her I wouldn't. Our daughter's new husband tested that promise at their wedding reception, in front of every person who had ever meant anything to us. And when I held my ground, he grabbed me by the lapel of my only good suit jacket and put his mouth so close to my ear that I could feel the heat coming off him. "You are going to sign those papers," he said, "or this family is finished." The room went so quiet you could hear the centerpiece candles burning. My daughter cried out his name from across the room. I looked at her once, long enough to see the horror on her face. Then I set my napkin on the table, pushed my chair back, and walked out of that banquet hall on my own 2 feet. That night, I sat in Connie's rocking chair on the porch and watched the last light go off the Blue Ridge. Then I went inside and opened the cedar box she had told me never to touch until I had no other choice. I had no other choice. To understand what came next, you need to understand what Thornfield Orchard is. It is not a hobby farm. It is not a weekend getaway. It is 40 acres of apple trees that Connie and I planted ourselves in the spring of 1987, when we were both 29 years old and foolish enough to believe that hard work was always enough. We had come down from Ohio with $17,000, a second-hand tractor, and a spiral notebook full of plans she had drawn up at the kitchen table of the apartment where we were living then. The first few years were brutal. We lost a whole row of trees to a late frost in '89. We nearly lost everything to drought in '93. But we held on. We pressed our first batch of hard cider in a barn we built ourselves, board by board, on the north end of the property. The first season we sold it at the county farmers market. A young woman bought 3 cases and came back the following week with her mother and bought 3 more. Her name was Adele Chen, and she would matter a great deal later in this story. By the time our daughter Lee was born, the orchard had found its footing. By the time Lee started kindergarten, we were selling cider at 24 stores across the valley. By the time she graduated high school, Thornfield was something real, something people drove an hour for. We ran a fall harvest festival every October that brought families in from Charlottesville and Fredericksburg and beyond. We had a tasting room in the old barn, exposed beams and wide plank floors, with a front porch that looked out over the rows of trees and the mountains behind them. People came for the apples. They stayed for the feeling of the place. I thought Lee understood what it meant. She had grown up inside it. She had helped her mother lead harvest tours since she was old enough to carry a half-bushel basket. But somewhere along the way, after college, after moving to Richmond, after meeting the man she eventually married, she had let someone convince her that the orchard was a weight I was carrying alone, that I was getting too old for it, that it was time for the next generation to unlock its potential. That phrase came from her husband. I heard it the first time, at Thanksgiving dinner, 3 years before the wedding, when he was still just her boyfriend. He sat at our table and ate Connie's pecan pie and talked about asset optimization and market timing and development corridors, while Connie listened without saying a word. She had been diagnosed 6 months earlier. She was still strong enough to sit at the table and refill his coffee cup, but I could see something working behind her eyes as he talked. She was paying attention in a way I wasn't. After he and Lee left that night, Connie stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes and didn't speak for a long time. "He is not what she thinks he is," she finally said. "Leigh loves him," I said. "I know she does." She turned off the water and dried her hands on the dish towel she'd had for 20 years, the one with the faded roosters printed on it. "That's what worries me." The next 2 years were hard ones. Her illness moved slowly at first, and then all at once, the way things tend to do. I spent most of my time in the hospital or at home by her side, and the orchard kept running the way it always had, because Connie had trained the staff well enough that they didn't need me hovering. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, in our bedroom, with the window open and the smell of apple blossom coming up from the south field. The last thing she said to me was about the cedar box in the safe. She told me where it was. She told me not to open it until I needed it. Then she told me she loved me and she was gone. I put the box out of my mind for 2 years. Grief has a way of narrowing your whole world down to the next hour, the next cup of coffee, the next row of trees that needs pruning. I moved through the days slowly and kept my promise to her in the only simple way I knew, By staying, by not selling, by being there every morning when the mist was still hanging on the mountains and the air smelled clean and cold. Lee got engaged 6 months after her mother passed. I held my peace. I smiled at the engagement photos. I wrote a check for the party because she asked me to, and because that is what fathers do. But I noticed things. I noticed the way her fiancé looked at the tasting room the first time he came back to visit after the engagement, the way his eyes moved across the ceiling beams and the bar and the porch, calculating something. I noticed how he asked about the deed and the mortgage, or rather the absence of a mortgage, since Connie and I had paid it off in 2011, and how his whole posture changed, just slightly, when I confirmed the place was free and clear. The week before the wedding, he came to me. He drove up the driveway on a Thursday afternoon in a business shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he had a leather portfolio under his arm. He sat down at my kitchen table and opened it and showed me what was inside. It was a development proposal. 60 pages, full-color architectural renderings. A boutique hotel where the tasting barn stood. Luxury cabin rentals scattered through the orchard rows. A rooftop bar where Connie's vegetable garden had been. He had given it a name already, the Thornfield at Blue Ridge, as if the name were a fact, as if the decision had already been made and I was simply the last one to be informed. He walked me through it page by page, his voice calm and persuasive, the rehearsed ease of a man who had told himself this story many times before telling it to me. The land was underperforming, he explained. A development like this would generate revenue that could support me comfortably in retirement. It was what was best for Lee, for the family, for the legacy. He used the word legacy the way some people use words they don't fully understand, as decoration, as a wrapper around something that had nothing to do with what the word actually means. I let him finish. I closed the portfolio. I slid it back across the table. No, I said. He looked at me the way a man looks at something that is not cooperating with him. Then he smiled. Think about it, he said. We can talk after the wedding. He wasn't asking. The ceremony was held at an estate venue outside Staunton, the kind of place with white painted fences and a restored manor house that rented by the day to families who wanted their occasion to feel historic. It was a beautiful September day, the sky that particular shade of blue you only get in the valley when the summer heat has finally let go. The mountains were still green above the tree line, not yet turned. Lee was radiant. I walked her down the aisle and put her hand in his and smiled through the whole thing, because that is what a father does on his daughter's wedding day. The reception was in the estate's banquet hall. 200 guests, ivory linens, tall arrangements of white flowers on every table, a band playing in the corner. I sat at the head table and kept my eyes on my daughter, and tried hard to feel only the parts of the evening that were good. I should have known from the way he watched me during dinner that something was coming. He waited until the toasts. After the best man and the maid of honor had said their pieces, he took the microphone. He was a natural with a microphone. He talked about Lee, with the fluency of a man who had learned exactly how to make a room love him. He talked about building something lasting, about family, about the meaning of legacy. The room leaned into it. My daughter cried happy tears. Then he looked across the room directly at me. He said that a wedding was a moment of new beginnings, that the greatest gift a parent could offer a child was not money but opportunity. That tonight, and he paused here for effect, long enough that the whole room leaned in a little, his new father-in-law would be entrusting Thornfield Orchard to the next generation, so that its future could be everything it always deserved to be. The applause came immediately. People heard a father passing the torch to his children. They didn't see the gun he was holding to my head. I sat completely still. Lee's face, from her seat at the center of the head table, went from happily tearful to confused in the space of a single second. She looked at me. She knew I had agreed to nothing. I could see it in her expression, that flicker of recognition of something not adding up. She started to say something, and then his eyes went to her, and he gave her a small, calming nod, and she stopped. He was already moving through the tables toward me, his hand extended, as if the keys were simply going to appear in his palm, because he had built a good enough story around them. He crouched beside my chair. The smile was still there, wide and useful. "The papers are in my car," he said quietly. "We step out after this next song. Nobody needs to know it wasn't planned." "I told you no on Thursday," I said. "My answer has not changed." The smile stayed on his face, but something behind his eyes went flat. "Don't do this tonight," he said. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "You are." He stood up. He stood there for a moment looking down at me, and I could see him running his calculation. 200 witnesses, a photographer circling nearby, an old man who was not going to move. He reached down and grabbed the lapel of my jacket, his grip hard, and pulled me slightly forward. He spoke quietly, close enough that only I could hear the words. "You are going to sign those papers, or I promise you this family is done. You will grow old alone on that hill." He let go. From her seat, Lee had seen the gesture. Not the words, but the physical act, the grab, the pull, the intent in his body. She was on her feet before he had fully straightened up. "Damon." Her voice cut across the music, sharp and cold. "What did you just do to my father?" He turned toward her, and I could see him preparing to reshape it, to make it harmless, to talk his way back into the version of the evening he had planned. I didn't wait. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I nodded once to the couple at the next table, people I had known for over 20 years who were staring at me with stunned and sorry faces. Then I walked, steadily and without rushing, toward the doors of the banquet hall. I heard Lee say his name again, harder this time. I heard the murmur of 200 voices beginning behind me. I pushed through the doors and stepped out into the cool, September night, and didn't stop walking until I reached my truck. The drive home took 40 minutes on roads I have known by heart for nearly 4 decades. I parked beside the cider barn. I unlocked it and walked inside. The smell hit me the way it always does. Oak barrels and pressed fruit and the faint sweetness that has been living in those walls for 30 years. I went to the small office in the back, the one with the oak desk Connie refinished by hand and the window that looks out over the south field, and I sat in the dark. I did not turn on the light for a long time. Then I went to the house. I went to the safe in the bedroom closet. I turned the combination, our wedding anniversary, the numbers unchanged in 38 years, and I reached past the land deeds, and the insurance files, and the tax records. And there, sitting on top of it all, was the cedar box. Small, smooth wood, no latch. She had fitted the lid so well it hardly needed one. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down under the overhead light. Inside, there were 4 things. The first was a small spiral notebook, the kind she always kept in her garden apron pocket. I opened it and understood immediately what it was. Not a journal, a ledger. Page after page in her careful handwriting, each entry dated and described. $41,000 over 3 years, loaned to my son-in-law before the engagement. Rent shortfalls she never told me about. A business investment he described to her as almost profitable. 2 car repairs that were supposedly emergencies. She had recorded every dollar. On the final page, the total was circled twice in red ink, with a date beside it 6 weeks before she died. She had known. She had seen him exactly as he was, and she had kept her own record. The second item was a USB drive. I brought my laptop from the shelf and plugged it in. One folder labeled with his initials, bank statements, credit card records, loan documents. I am not a financial man, but even I could read what those pages said. He was in serious trouble. Lines of credit extended past their limits, a margin call notice from a brokerage account, business loans secured against assets he did not fully own. He had the appearance of success, the way a theater set has the appearance of a building. Convincing from one angle, nothing behind it. The third item was a folded piece of paper, her handwriting. It said simply, "He asked me to sign a power of attorney over the orchard." I said no. I recorded the conversation. Taped to the bottom of the note was a small voice recorder, no bigger than my thumb. I held it in my hand for a long time before I pressed play. His voice came out of that small machine, so clearly it made the kitchen feel smaller. And beneath his voice, hers, thinner than I remembered from the last good years, the illness in it, but underneath the thinness there was still something that could not be worn down. "Connie, I'm asking you as family," he said on the recording. "This is just a precaution. If something were to happen to Fletcher, you'd want the orchard protected properly." Her answer came without a pause. "Damon, I have been watching people my whole life. I know what a precaution looks like, and I know what this is. The answer is no. I'd like you to leave now." A silence. "Then you're making a mistake." "I make my own mistakes," she said. "That's how I learned to recognize one." The recording ended. I set the machine down on the table and sat in the kitchen and let the quiet settle around me. Outside, the night was clear, and stars were out over the orchard, and the trees stood in their rows the way they always had, patient and dark against a sky full of light. Then I looked at the fourth thing. A manila envelope, sealed, with a law firm's name in the upper corner, and the words Conservation Easement Agreement typed across the front. I placed it in the center of the table and called Monroe. Monroe Adkins had been my attorney since we bought this land in 1987. He was 4 years older than me, and had never once failed to answer when I called. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything, keeping my voice level, the way you do when the inside of you is anything but. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Make yourself a cup of coffee. Don't open that envelope without me. I will be there at 7. He was there at 6:45. We sat at the kitchen table, and Monroe opened the envelope with his pocket knife, the same one he has carried since I've known him, and we read through the documents together. He took a long time with them. I watched his face. I have known Monroe long enough to read him, and what I saw moving across his expression, slowly and unmistakably, was awe. 3 years before she died, Connie had contacted the Shenandoah Valley Heritage Land Trust. She had negotiated a conservation easement on the orchard property, a legally registered agreement that restricted the land in perpetuity from commercial development, preserved its agricultural designation, and included a first right of refusal clause. If ownership was ever transferred, sold, or conveyed outside the Oaks family name without the trust's written consent, the trust held the legal right to purchase the property immediately at a price she had already negotiated and agreed upon. Monroe set the document down. "If he had gotten you to sign those papers last night," he said, "the second that deed transferred, the clause would have activated automatically. He wouldn't have gotten his hotel. He wouldn't have gotten the development rights. He would have gotten the right to sell a conservation-protected apple orchard to a land trust." He looked at the number on the page, for a price that would have covered his debts and not much else. I looked at her signature on the agreement, clear and steady, dated 14 months before she died. "She didn't just say no to him," Monroe said quietly. "She made sure no would always be the answer, even after she was gone." Monroe made the calls that morning. He contacted the trust to notify them of the attempted hostile transfer and request that they activate their monitoring rights. Then he placed one call to Adele Chen. I had not spoken to Adele in 2 years. She had gone from those first 3 cases of cider at the farmers' market to building one of the Mid-Atlantic's most recognized regional food brands, Blue Ridge Provisions, organic, farm-sourced, distributed across 6 states. Connie had mentored her in the early years, answering questions at the market table on Saturday mornings, mailing handwritten notes with fermentation recipes she had developed over decades. Adele had never forgotten it. She called back within the hour. Monroe explained the situation calmly and briefly. There was a pause on the line. Then Adele said, "Connie was the reason I didn't give up in year 3. Tell me what you need." What I needed was for my son-in-law to understand who he had actually been dealing with. He found out on the 3rd day of his honeymoon. The sequence came together later, piece by piece, the way things do after the fact. Monroe had quietly notified the development group behind the proposed Thornfield project, a firm out of Northern Virginia, that the property carried a registered conservation easement, making commercial development legally impossible, and that this had been on record with the county for years. The investors pulled out within 24 hours. Then Adele's attorneys contacted his primary lender regarding an unresolved account connected to a Blue Ridge Provisions subsidiary, a debt that had been quietly accumulating interest for 2 years. His lenders called in their notes. He flew home 4 days early. Monroe arranged a meeting at the trust's office in Harrisonburg, a plain, practical conference room, long table, filing cabinets, the kind of space where things get resolved without ceremony. I was already seated when he walked in. He looked like a man who had not slept since leaving the country. Wrinkled shirt, the particular gray that spreads across a person's face when the ground has given way beneath them. He saw Monroe. He saw the trust's attorney, and then he saw me. He stopped in the doorway. I looked at him and said nothing. He sat down. Monroe placed the documents on the table one at a time. The easement agreement, the right of refusal clause, the recorded deed restriction, the spiral notebook with its red-circled total. Last, he set the voice recorder down and pressed play. Connie's voice filled the room again, her refusal, quiet and absolute, her patience with a man who had never deserved it. When the recording ended, no one spoke for a moment. The trust's attorney outlined his options. He could sign a formal acknowledgement of the easement and release any claim to the Oaks property, or he could face civil action for attempted interference with a registered land conservation agreement. In addition to the loan documentation, which constituted collectible debt, and the recording, which established a documented pattern of attempted coercion. He signed. His hand was steady, which was the last steady thing about him. On the drive back through the valley, the mountains were beginning to turn. The first yellows were showing on the ridgeline, the edge of autumn just arriving. Monroe drove. I watched the hills go past. She was 10 steps ahead of him the whole time, Monroe said. She was 10 steps ahead of everyone, I said. That was just Connie. 3 weeks later, Lee came home. She didn't call ahead. I saw her car coming up the drive on a Saturday morning when I was in the South Field checking the late-season apples. She parked near the barn and got out slowly, like someone not quite sure of her footing. She was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, the clothes she had worn here growing up, and her hair was down. She walked to the edge of the field and stopped. I set down my basket and walked over to her. She didn't try to explain it or excuse it. She just said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't see him for what he was. I wanted to, and I didn't." Her voice was even, but her eyes weren't, and I could see it had cost her something to say it plainly like that, without softening it. I looked at my daughter, and I thought about the 43 years since I had held her in a hospital in Columbus, and thought I understood what love meant. It turns out you keep learning what it means. You learn it again, every time. I put my arm around her shoulders. For a while we just stood there, looking at the trees. Eventually she asked me what Connie had left in the box. I told her everything, piece by piece, walking slowly through the field while I told it. She was quiet through most of it. When I got to the voice recording, she pressed her hand over her mouth and looked away toward the mountains for a long moment. She knew, Lee said. She always knew, I said. She just waited until she had something solid to say it with. I went to the barn and came back with an extra pair of work gloves. I held them out to her. She turned them over in her hands. "We've got about 2 weeks before peak harvest," I said. "The Fuji's on the east end are going to be first. I could use the help if you're staying." She looked at the gloves. Then she looked out at the orchard, at the long, ordered rows of trees her mother and I had planted before she was born, that had outlasted drought and frost, and a grief that had nearly emptied me out. She put the gloves on. We started with the Fuji's that same morning. That harvest was the best we had seen in a decade. The tasting barn was full every weekend. Families spread out on the lawn with their cider flights, and their apple bags and their children running between the rows. The Blue Ridge turned red and gold above us, and the air smelled of wood smoke and ripe fruit in cool air, which is a smell that belongs to that valley and nowhere else. Adele came out one Saturday with her family. After closing, we sat on the porch and opened a bottle of this year's first pressing, and she raised her glass toward the trees. "To Connie," she said. "To Connie," I said. We drank. The cider was cold and clean, the way it is in a good year, when the trees have been tended by people who understand that some things are worth more than any number you can put beside them. At the end of harvest season, a sign went up at the entrance to the drive, simple, carved from an oak plank I had been saving in the barn for years. Lee hung it herself with a stepladder and a level, the same precision her mother used to bring to everything. She stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. "Thornfield Orchard, established 1987, in memory of Constance Oaks, who kept her promises." Beneath, in smaller letters, "Protected land, not for sale, not ever." She said, "It's right, Dad." It was. It was exactly right. This land was never just about apples. It was about a woman who spent the last years of her life quietly making certain that love and loyalty and 40 years of honest work would outlast any man who believed those things were simply numbers waiting to be moved around. She was right about that. She was right about most things. And she had trusted me enough to let me be the one to see it through. I kept my promise, Connie. I kept it.